Alright, so we're about 2 years removed from the last Star Wars movie and approximately 30,000 hot takes beyond what anybody could possibly consider reasonable, so why am I adding to the garbage dump that the Star Wars discourse has become? Well, because no one's gotten it right yet. I've seen folks complain about the sequel trilogy, deconstruct it, analyze it, parse it, praise it, recontextualize and reevaluate it, and the discourse seems to me in a complete state of utter exhaustion. But in a way, I think it's a signal that it's time to wipe the slate clean and start fresh, approaching these three films with clear eyes and really coming at them from a new perspective. So let's start with this. Before we get too deep into this, let me make one thing clear. When I first saw Star Wars Episode Roman numeral 9 The Rise of Skywalker, I was disappointed with it, and with the sequel trilogy overall. No, I don't think that's too surprising, or even controversial a thing to say at this point. When taken as a whole, I think that pretty much everybody felt some level of disappointment with these films. The reasons why people felt this disappointment varied, often quite wildly. And just like people disagree on what went wrong with these three movies, opinions also seem to differ as to what a less disappointing version of the sequel trilogy might have looked like. So, let me start with some tough love here, and this might hurt to hear. These are the Star Wars movies that we got. And no amount of whining and complaining, no matter how loud and how correct you are, will change that. We had one shot at episodes 7, 8, and 9, and this is what we're stuck with. You can ignore them, you can wipe them from your head canon, they might actually wipe them from real canon, but we ain't ever gonna get another set of films to replace them, and you, me, and every Star Wars fan there is and ever will be, has to deal with this being the sequel trilogy that we got. And as a Star Wars fan, I want very much not to be disappointed in them. Heck, in an ideal world, I'd like to enjoy them, to smile when I'm watching them, and to feel an emotional payoff when I complete them. But barring that, at the very least, I'd like very much not to feel deflated and flat when I watch them, and what's more, I'd like to look at them as having some sort of point, something meaningful to add to the 9-film so-called Skywalker saga. So this video is about the process that I went through to make that happen, because I do think that if you reframe your expectations of these movies and look at them through a slightly sympathetic lens, there is a lot to enjoy about them. And even though they're not the episodes 7, 8, and 9 that I wanted, I am no longer as disappointed that they're the episodes 7, 8, and 9 that we have. And I'd like to take you along the journey I went through to get to this point. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. My first major disappointment with the sequel trilogy came when I realized that, no, these films are not overly interested in Luke Skywalker, Princess Leia, and Han Solo. These are the characters that I grew up with, and that I wanted to see. And so the fact that Han Solo dies without seeing Luke, the fact that Luke behaves like a jerk to Rey, and the fact that Leia spends the entire trilogy without really doing very much at all, made me really sad. This seemed like a wasted opportunity to me. And more than that, all three characters appear to have had their lives completely decimated in the 20 years since we last saw them. What amazing adventures led to these pathetic new circumstances? I wanted to know, and I wanted to see those events happen on screen. But instead we're left with a gap between episodes 7 and 9 that is as mysterious as it is tragic. And maybe that's a good thing? Okay, so hear me out. In a galaxy that seems to get smaller with every passing movie, TV show, book, comic, and video game, part of me appreciates that these seismic shakeups exist as a sort of nebulous lost period of time. Whatever happened that turned those triumphant faces we last left in Return of the Jedi into these defeated shadows we see in The Force Awakens is so tragic and damaging that it's beyond dramatization. In a lot of ways, it would have been emotionally satisfying to witness the day Han and Leia said goodbye, or to see Luke Skywalker leave his friends in exile. But it also would have diminished those events, made them smaller by defining exactly what happened, when to us fans who love those characters, these events are almost mythic in their importance, and by never showing them, they remain mythic in our minds. There is, of course, also a logistical problem. It's been 35 years since Return of the Jedi, both in terms of the films being made and the events in the story. How in the world can you ever hope to satisfyingly sum up all those years of turbulent history? I don't know the answer to that. And I really don't have a sense of what storytelling solution would have been satisfying to me. And looking at it this way, I don't know how disappointed I can feel in the sequel trilogy for not doing the impossible. And maybe, just maybe, my expectations of these films being a continuation of the original trilogy were misplaced. These films were never going to be a satisfying follow-up to the events we saw in episodes 4, 5, and 6. So let's forgive these sequel films of that burden, and try to appreciate these movies on their own terms and on their own merits. And that leads me to my second disappointment that I felt while watching them. This is one that I know a lot of other people felt, even people who enjoyed the movies, the idea that these new characters' arcs seemed aimless and disjointed, and that Rey, Finn, Poe, and Rose never really click in that same archetypal, clear-cut way that Han, Luke, and Leia do. Let's begin our discussion with Rey. The U-turns that were made in her character's development are legendary at this point. She was an orphan scavenger on a garbage planet until circumstances forced her to join the Resistance. She was the classic Luke Skywalker archetype, until she was rejected by Luke and was revealed to have been a, quote, nobody that didn't matter. Except that she was also a Palpatine this whole time and is the linchpin to a decades-long conspiracy to restore the Empire to power, and also she decides that she is a Skywalker after all, and also she might be romantically linked to Kylo Ren, and also maybe Finn, or maybe no one. It's kind of a mess, am I right? And the same is true of Finn, the ex-stormtrooper who was a trained killer that was abducted by the First Order and raised as a killing machine, but he also is a bumbling comic relief character, and also romantically linked to Rey and Rose and Jannah? And he's also Force-sensitive, I think. The scene explaining it was cut, but I think J.J. Abrams talked about it in an interview. And then there's Poe, who's often just a cipher, vaguely written in a way that sometimes throws out potentially interesting backstory elements that seem like they could work, but that don't quite come together. And also, Rose was there. Oh, poor Rose. Absent from episode 7, abandoned in episode 9, she brought some interesting ideas to the one film they bothered to put her in. Though even in that single film, I'm not quite sure whether she's a low-level Resistance grease monkey or a pilot, and when, in the time that we see her and Finn interacting, did a romance blossom. And so, what do we do about this mess? And it is, I think, a mess. Even if you don't agree with every one of my criticisms, I don't think it's disputed that character development in the sequel trilogy ended up being kind of ad hoc and improvised as the series progressed, and that the places where these characters ended up weren't part of some grand master plan. This means that we're left with false starts, promising ideas left unfulfilled, and a general sense of incoherence. How can we enjoy the stories of these characters when following them leads to twists, turns, and roundabouts that leave us scrambling? Well, just give me a second, alright? Okay, is there a way to view this sloppy character writing as being a feature and not a bug? Bear with me here. Most of us entered into episode 7 expecting Rey to be something, right? Whether it was literally a Skywalker or a Kenobi or a Palpatine, or if it was just a spiritual successor to Luke, we watched that movie attempting to slot her into a specific Star Wars archetype. She's the farm boy turned chosen one, just like we saw in the original trilogy, just like we saw in the prequel trilogy. We know the rhythms of Star Wars, and we know what to expect. And Rey herself wants to fit into the story in this way. She sits on Jakku, waiting for her story to be defined for her. In The Force Awakens, when given an opportunity to join Han Solo and to strike out on her own path, she resists. She wants her path to be forged by her lineage, for her parents to return and tell her who she is. And when she finally leaves Jakku, she has a similar goal in meeting Luke. She wants to submit to Luke, to become his apprentice, for him to teach her what her role is and who she should be. And Luke denies her this easy answer. No, she doesn't just slot into the narrative in a neat and tidy way. Except that in The Rise of Skywalker, she's given that chance. She discovers she's a Palpatine. She is, in fact, significant. She is the linchpin of a decades-long scheme to restore the Emperor, resurrect the dark side, and extinguish light from the galaxy. So, congratulations, Rey. You got exactly what you wanted. But Rey resists this. She has grown as a character since her days on Jakku. Rey will not let her parentage define her in the way that she used to crave. She is past that impulse. After being rejected again and again from having some pre-established role in the story of Star Wars, she now knows that she doesn't need it. That she doesn't have to let the story tell her who she is, and that she can define her role for herself. In many ways, this idea that you should choose your own role and resist having your role dictated to you by the past is evident in every main character. Finn was told where he was in the classic trilogy's world order. He was a stormtrooper. But he resists that, pushing to define himself and trying out a variety of roles. Is he the leading man saving Rey from Jakku? Is he a resistance operative saving BB-8? Is he a comic relief character, a freedom fighter with Rose? Is he someone that will sacrifice himself for a greater cause, or is he a Jedi? I don't know, and neither does he. And there is something that I relate to in his struggle to figure out where he fits in a world that he didn't create, and that he's struggling to make his way through. I hasten to say that none of this, I think, is by design. I don't think that J.J. Abrams, Rian Johnson, and Kathleen Kennedy had a master plan to create a commentary on the struggles of people in their 20s trying to define themselves in relation to the past and where society wants to place them. But a big part of me does understand what these characters are going through. How desperate you can be to have your place in the world defined, and how angry and confused you can be when the world doesn't have much use for you. And when it does find a slot for you, how unsatisfying that can end up feeling. Life is a bit directionless, and while stories like Star Wars often promise us that our adventures will fit neatly into a 3-act structure with setups and payoffs and natural conclusions, life is full of dead ends and disappointing destinations. Which leads us to the biggest problem of these 3 films, and that is the plot's a mess. I don't want to go into the behind-the-scenes drama too much, but I think it's pretty much established now that this trilogy was not planned out from the beginning, and that the writers and directors were kind of making things up as they went along. And sure, this was true of the original trilogy as well. As much as George Lucas occasionally claimed to have had it all worked out ahead of time, it's clear this wasn't actually the case. Luke and Leia kiss several times, then they're revealed to be brother and sister. Obi-Wan states that Darth Vader and Luke's father are 2 different people, then Empire Strikes Back changes that. The character of the Emperor comes completely out of nowhere, and they drastically redesign his appearance between films. And then there's stuff like Han's carbonite freezing, kind of leading nowhere, as it's undone pretty quickly in the next movie in a sequence that really has no purpose in the larger plot and exists just to hastily undo a bold decision made in the previous film. And then there's little things like how the idea that if Luke fails, there is another, goes nowhere. But when stuff like this happens in the sequel trilogy, it often seems an order of magnitude bigger. Like when the movies completely forget about Rose after taking an entire film to set her up, or how the movies never quite explain who the Knights of Ren are, or gives them a purpose within the story. And what are the logistics of Palpatine escaping from the second Death Star, traveling to a planet in the middle of nowhere, building a fleet of advanced Star Destroyers, creating Snoke in a test tube, and sending him out to corrupt Ben Solo? Just how do we deal with all of this? How do we watch 3 films with so little overarching plot or narrative coherence and feel satisfied with the result? How in the world can we not feel disappointed with this chaotic series of events that feels hastily slapped together by committee? Well, here's my pitch. Star Wars was influenced by the old movie serials of George Lucas's youth. These were short, one-reel adventures that played almost like soap operas. You would have startling developments, twists, turns, and cliffhangers. The goal of their creators was not to tell one large story, but to keep you entertained while you were watching the movie, and to make sure that you felt compelled to come back to the theater so that you could watch what happened next. It was sloppy and haphazard storytelling, but when you look back at some of those films, there is something endearing about the ramshackle nature of it. These are writers and directors and actors who are trying to put on a show for you. And maybe it doesn't all work, but they're throwing so much at you that it's hard not to like some of it. You can't think too hard about the sequel trilogy, or it will all fall apart. And there's no way that I can pretend like that's a good thing. There's no way that I can spin that into being an asset of the films. If you take the story at all seriously, you will find yourself with unanswerable questions and unresolved plot holes. So when I sit down to watch the sequel trilogy, I don't approach it in the same way that I do when I watch the original trilogy. I don't think about how the different elements link together, how setups are leading to conclusions, how thematic connections establish emotionally satisfying payoffs. When I'm watching the sequel trilogy, I watch them in the same way that I watch a lot of other big-budget blockbusters. It's spectacle, it's razzle-dazzle, it's flashing lights and exciting music, it's big emotions and giant fight scenes. Because the special effects are good, and the world building, the set and prop designs, the creatures, the ships, there are a lot of fun things to watch. And the music and sound design remain top-notch. If you turn off the part of your brain that cares about higher-level storytelling, you will find a ton of craftsmanship and technical expertise on display. And that's not nothing. It may sound like a cop-out to say, meh, just enjoy the shining keys dangling in front of your face. But I remember watching Star Wars over and over again as a kid, and I remember poring over the visual dictionaries and technical manuals, obsessed with the construction of the world, the stop-motion tauntauns, the matte paintings, the miniatures, the costumes, the sets. All of those elements that were so crucial to the original trilogy are still here. I can imagine a kid falling in love with this universe in the same way that I fell in love with Hoth, Tatooine, and Cloud City. And as an adult, I can appreciate the sheer artistry that went into building the universe of these movies. And so, I don't know, will the sequel trilogy ever be a set of movies that I love? I don't think so, but I've grown more fond of them. I can see positives to some of the aspects that I initially dismissed as disappointing, and I can look past some of the larger flaws in storytelling choices. I certainly don't hate them, and they don't make me angry, and I can accept that they are a part of Star Wars, this franchise that I love, and that is a part of me. These movies will never be the sequel trilogy that I wanted, but they are the sequel trilogy that we got. And as time goes on, I think I'll be more and more able to release these movies from the burden of my expectations and to accept them for what they are, because they're not worthless. They're not without redeeming qualities, and they are worth appreciating on their own terms.